require going down, category by category, sector by sector. There's no all or nothing answer there. There are areas where China has caught up, extraordinarily, and China is, the clear leader in quite a few areas. 5G is an obvious example. They now want to catch up in semiconductors, as we were discussing earlier, solar panels, high-speed rail cars, and this kind of thing. So China's, made tremendous strides. But, innovation ultimately is about adaptation to the local market. And, for the Indian market, for the Southeast Asian market, for other parts of the world, it's still very much possible to compete with with China on quality. Just look at medical devices. Sure, China produces a lot of them, but as a lot of countries are learning right now, they're not necessarily the best, right? And that's why Korea, Taiwan, Japan, and quite a few other countries are saying, wait a minute, I don't think the world needs to be flooded with Chinese medical devices like with rubber duckies. You need a bit more quality control when it comes to the medical devices. So, testing kits and equipment and so forth. So, I think that let's be clear that even as China moves up the value chain, it isn't a monopolistic provider of everything yet. And it is the mere sort of awakening to the competition. Let's go back to telecom equipment. 5G has really unleashed what I called the infrastructure arms race in connectography, and this is why you can't make a linear forecast. You can't say that Huawei is going to take over the world when it's just aroused Western economies and governments to start to begin to strategically back Nokia and Ericsson and make sure that they and Docomo and others start to get the contracts around the world. So the tide can turn very, very quickly in these areas.
Yeah, and when I write about Huawei and what's going on there, I classify that as the strategic weaponization of supply chains, which it turns out to be in many dimensions. Is that now, countries, particularly the Trump administration, is focusing on, well, we want to control the supply chain for these strategic products. And that opens up a whole can of worms across the globe if that continues.
Well, you and I, I'm sure, agree with this statement, this sort of aphorism, even the supply chain has a supply chain. So even when you think you're controlling the supply chain, you may not have fully mapped out the second and third degrees of sort of supply there. And it often remains global, even when one thinks that, you've totally endogenized it. So I don't think that the U.S. or quite frankly many countries have really mapped that out fully. But that process is finally happening. And look, I think you and I have been calling for that for any number of years. Countries have a right and indeed a necessity, as we've learned in this pandemic, to support strategic sectors, whether it is to ensure redundancy, and critical access to an industrial or other goods during a crisis, or on the basis of job creation, national security, and so forth. And every country has a different approach to defining what those needs and parameters are. But that's the game that has been played for centuries.
And, that's a good segue to another topic that I'd like you to share with our listeners as well. You have interviewed with CNN's Fareed Zakaria, and you indicated in an interview that coming out of COVID-19, it will become apparent that our world will consist of three regionally based economic systems. And I found that to be rather insightful. Can you share with our listeners what these three regional clusters would consist of and how they could possibly change supply chain, economic, or material flows?
Absolutely, and they certainly will. And this is something that COVID-19 is accelerating, but I want to be clear that it's not something that COVID-19 has instigated, because regionalization and regional economic gravity is the better part of globalization. As we were just briefly alluding to earlier, 60% of Asian trade is internal, 70% of European trade is internal. And in North America, owing to the trade war, the U.S. has had in 2019 more than $300 billion of bilateral trade with Canada, more than $300 billion of bilateral trade with Mexico, and about $270 billion with China. So we already have this, and then USMCA, you and I are speaking now in early July, is gone into effect. July the 1st.
It did.
So, yeah, we have the new NAFTA as well. So I have, long believed in the inevitability of a North American Union, irrespective of, border walls and, tit for tat issues on, some industry-specific tariffs with Canada and so on. It is really inevitable that these three large countries at peace with each other, sharing this mega continent with tremendous complementarities in energy, agriculture, industry, technology, human capital, finance, and so on. They're incredible complementarities. We're very blessed in a way to be North American, and it's something that America, often takes for granted, but I don't think it will as much anymore. So that's, the regionalization of supply chains there is going to be critical. What's it all about in the end? Supply meeting demand, and the achieving a greater degree of regional autarky, or at least just self-sufficiency, is about understanding or harnessing the land, labor, and capital of a given region. And North America has it in abundance. Europe does too, and so does Asia. So it's not a bad thing. I view it something as almost organically inevitable that the world moves in this direction. And let's remember that in certain areas, when we think about the importance of bearing in mind the impact of supply chains and trade on climate change and other existential, global issues, we don't really want to have global energy supply chains, right? We don't want to be digging, coal out of the ground or piping oil across continents or on tankers. There's just no need for that, and it's obviously tremendously destructive for the global ecosystem. So less globalization would be a fantastic achievement in some of these areas, but in others, it would be, sort of counterproductive, right? To raise tariffs on things that are not strategically sensitive, that basically just harm your own consumers by raising prices for them. That makes no sense.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's interesting perspective. I wanted our listeners to hear that, because we're recording this particular podcast on July 2nd, and as you pointed out yesterday, USMCA went into effect. And when I wrote about it, I basically contexted it by saying there's a heck of a lot of knots in the trade agreement right now, and it's going to take a long time to sort them all out. But in the end, it may turn out to be one of the most strategic regional trade agreements fostered, in terms of North America. And to your points, it may well be. We'll have to see.
Well, it establishes a new baseline that also caters to or responds to the critique that's been there, in a valid critique to some degree for more than 20 years, which is around environmental and labor standards. So now enforcement is, going to be critical, but it's also the capacity for enforcement is much stronger than it was a couple of decades ago. And the pressure to do so on the grounds that we, have an environmental agenda or impetus is stronger than ever. So the potential to have this agreement better functioning than NAFTA is very high, which is why, again, even as someone who thinks, in global terms and focuses a lot on Asia, this is the most important thing that happened in the world yesterday, is that agreement. And I think it has very significant and likely positive long-term consequences.
Absolutely. And before we run out of time, let's stay on that theme of sustainability for a minute or two. There are perspectives that global supply chains will morph from those that were predominantly driven by seeking the lowest cost global source, and China often comes to mind about that, to those driven more by the broader need for business and supply chain sustainability. When one considers that some supply chains source within Asia because of a regulatory environment that may be perceived to be more business friendly, do you believe that this will change in the coming decade?
I think that, actually regulatory competition, to attract investment, foreign investment is a constant phenomenon. I describe this as the tug of war, right? The tug of war encompasses our trade wars and this investment competition. It's a never ending sort of reality, and whether it is for manufacturing, whether it's for services, whether it's human capital and talent, financial services, and so forth. This is something that is where Asians have continuously found ways to sort of move up the value chain, especially special economic zones that were mostly industrial. Now you have sort of offshore financial center developments and these kinds of things spanning Kazakhstan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so forth. So there is absolutely but I believe generally speaking, this is not a race to the bottom, right? It's a race to the top in some ways, because these jurisdictions have to also comply with new global norms and offer a fairly high degree of transparency and predictability. There's new economic substance regulations coming out of the OECD that are requiring some degree of match or harmonization between the economic activity in a country and the actual labor force in that country, and so on. So there's a multiple layers of regulatory dynamics underway. The global pressure for upward compliance, these countries' desire to be viewed as a safe investment destination. Of course, that's more critical than ever, because you have the overlapping crises of low commodities prices, the COVID-19 virus, foreign capital, portfolio capital heavily pulling out of emerging and frontier markets. And these are exactly the moments when pragmatic, rational, developing countries that don't have a high margin for error, what they do is they say, it's time to, liberalize our capital account, comply to global corporate governance standards, privatize, lumbering, inefficient state-owned industries. So drawing in capital isn't necessarily a race to the bottom, right? It's about saying we actually can't afford to be, lazy or mismanage our economy the way we could in sort of go-go times. So what I see in terms of Asia in particular is a very high degree of pragmatism compared to 20 years ago during the Asian financial crisis, when leaders across the board sort of buried their heads in the sand. That's not what's happening right now.
That's good news. I think that's very good news, because sustainability among supply chain circles, multi-industry supply chain circles, is really stepping up right now. And I think that's a good thing.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely a good thing. So, Parag, as always, lots of great insights to share with our audience. And I want to sincerely thank you for taking the time out of your very, very busy schedule for sharing these insights. And I extend good wishes to you in your continued efforts. And any closing thoughts that or takeaways that you want to leave with our Supply Chain Management podcast listeners?
Well, never bet against the supply chain. Never believe that the supply chain is, going to be controlled by any one hegemonic force. The supply chain is something that, like globalization itself, is bigger than all of us. When people talk about deglobalization today, my eyes sort of roll. Even though we just spoke about how regionalization is sort of, ascendant, let's remember that there's, like as we were saying, the supply chain as a supply chain. There's a global dimension still to so many aspects of our world economy, and we should never bet against it. And, following the supply chains is really the path to understanding how our world is evolving.
Great words of wisdom. Thank you very much. And
Thank you, Bob.
And with that, this is Bob Ferrari, editor of Supply Chain Matters, signing off until our next episode. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Supply Chain Matters podcast, hosted by Bob Ferrari. For further information and insights, please visit our websites, www.theferrarigroup.com or the Supply Chain Matters blog at www.supply-chain-matters.com. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye.